Welcome explorers today. Dive into this thrilling TTP narration of Ghosts in the Avalanche by Banancake, an ongoing fan-made book from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vickery, the honey badger. Date, standardized human time May 14, 2137. Chapter 2, Dear Sister. The spaceport bustled with foot traffic. Humans hurried about, many of them carrying huge amounts of luggage. After all, leaving the planet isn't like leaving the country. You need a lot more than just clothing and basic hygiene items when your destination is in an entirely different world. I saw only one other Venlil the entire time I was there. Earth was getting more visitors, but Venlil who would dare to venture to Earth were rare. Many feared being eaten alive by wild animals, which may not have been entirely irrational. The whole environment of the spaceport was just stressful. It seemed that one couldn't simply walk into this complex without being in a huge hurry, and Andy and I were no exception. I struggled to keep pace with the human as she marched through the massive corridor. 6, 7, there, that's your terminal, let's go. I followed Andy as we fumbled down an escalator, completely nullifying its entire purpose. I tripped a few times as the moving platform confused my balance while I tried to keep pace with the human. Finally, my paws hit the tile floor again, and I hurried beside Andy, doubling over as I caught my breath. The human looked down at me and crossed her arms. Ha! Somebody should invest in a treadmill. You know that, I took in a deep breath, isn't how it works. I would have carried you if you'd asked, she snickered. I laughed and shook my head at her. And be paraded through the spaceport on your shoulders? Why not? It'd be adorable. And it'd draw way too much attention. Andy looked around for a moment before mumbling through her teeth. Well, you're already doing that. I straightened my back and looked around. Sure enough, dozens of humans were staring across the floor at me. This place would be a nightmare for any Venlil that wasn't used to humans. Hundreds of predatory eyes locked onto me from all directions. Some even seemed to be taking pictures on their phones, giving the impression that they either knew who I was or Venlil were just that rare of a sight around here. I quickly became anxious to get out of there. I worried about how my sister might react. Sure, there were a lot of humans on Venlil Prime, but there were a lot more here. This spaceport might contain the single highest concentration of humans she'd ever encountered. Even I was feeling stressed just standing there with so many people staring at me. I was glad that we got there in time. I couldn't imagine her being alone in a place like this. I anxiously watched as people filed in from the corridor in front of me. Given that this was a ship from Venlil Prime, I assumed most of the humans were visiting home. It should have been easy to pick out a Venlil in the crowd, but as the seconds dragged on, I started to fear that we'd gotten the wrong terminal. I stood there, scanning the crowd nervously before I saw a pair of ears sticking up within the sea of humans. Suddenly, I was filled with agonizing anticipation. I'd been waiting for this day for months. My sister and I had spoken with each other quite often over subspace. In fact, she was the only family member I kept frequent contact with. This would be the first time I'd seen anyone from home face to face since the battle. Nervous, I took a breath and pushed forward with Andy close behind. I slipped through the wall of people going past me and walked out onto the empty floor beyond. There stood my sister with a bag in tow behind her. Her eyes landed on me and widened slightly. I stopped in my tracks and stepped back before signaling hello with my tail. Her ears lay sideways, and her face tensed up as she slowly approached. Vickery? I stepped forward. Yeah. It's me. I chuckled nervously. I'd rehearsed this moment countless times in my imagination, but now that I was here, I had no idea what to say. It was so odd. We'd grown up together, shared everything, and argued over anything, yet now it was as if we were total strangers. It's good to see you, I managed to squeeze out. She started marching toward me while I spoke. Without warning, she winded back a paw and slapped me across the face. I heard Andy gasp behind me as I held the side of my face and looked at her, stunned. She had her paws clasped over her mouth. "I'm sorry. I promised myself I wouldn't do that," she squeaked. My ears stood up. She hadn't changed a bit. "It's okay," I laughed. "That's probably the least I deserve." I'm sorry." I flinched as she charged forward again. This time, she threw her arms around my neck, sobbing. I hesitated for a moment before holding her tight. She buried her face in the poncho over my shoulders. "I thought you were dead," she croaked. "I know. I'm sorry." A bizarre mixture of happiness and guilt fell over me. I imagined what it must have been like. Cardinal was declared lost with all hands a week after the battle. For a whole week, I was declared dead. I often wondered how my family coped with that. What memories they clung onto. After a while, I pulled her off of me, wiping the tears from her eyes. "I'm so glad you're here," I muttered softly. I saw Andy standing a few feet away next to us. She had her hands cupped over her mouth, and somehow, she was crying more than both of us. She sniffled and wiped her eyes with her palms. "Oh my God, I love a good family reunion. You two are just so adorable," she strained. I laughed as I wiped under my own eyes. "Andrea, this is Vivri," I said, gesturing to my sister. "Vivri, this is Andy. We work together, and she was kind enough to drive me over here to get you." "Thanks for looking out for my brother," Vivri said somewhat timidly. "Oh, no thanks is necessary. This has made this whole trip well worthwhile, even if your queasy brother almost ruined my car." She rubbed her nose on her sleeve, sniffling. "Your names sound really similar." She looked between us for a moment. "In fact, you both look really similar too." Vivri put an arm around me. "We're twins," she announced. Andy looked like she was going to explode. She placed her hands over her mouth and gasped as if suddenly realizing something. "Vic and Vivi." She laughed gleefully as she marched us away from the terminal. "Come on, let's go before I die of cuteness overload." Vivi looked over at me as Andy ushered us toward the exit, squeezing us together. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know, but I think your name is Vivi now." Vivri was a little confused about her ride home at first, but I managed to pass the car off as a taste of human culture rather than the machine that allowed me to get to Vancouver in time. It was a cover-up, but that didn't make it a lie. When we weren't breaking the law, the car had a sort of charm to it that I couldn't put a paw on. The whole experience was just so raw. Everything was audible through the metal paneling surrounding us. The engine would rumble as we accelerated and fade to a drone, giving way to the sound of the tires rolling over the asphalt beneath us. An autonomous car was stiff and robotic in the way it handled, but it was as if we were a boat on a calm sea with Andy at the wheel. The car took every turn gracefully, gliding effortlessly between lanes and around bends on the highway. I sat in the back seat with Vivri. Her eyes were glued to the passing landscape around us as we traveled. Mountains covered in lush alpines dominated the horizon as we ascended out of a valley. I could see vast shadows crawling over the ground as clouds overhead floated in front of the bright noon sun. Flocks of birds would occasionally pass overhead, creating hypnotic patterns in the sky over the endless sea of mountains. The vast expanse of life. My sister and I had maintained fairly regular contact since I left the wilderness. In fact, she was the first one I contacted. Of all my family members, she seemed to be the one that at least grasped the concept of why I wouldn't come home. The rest of my family didn't get it, as much as I tried to explain. My father, in particular, was angry with me. He never trusted the humans and begged me to stay home after he'd learned that I volunteered. He didn't understand then, and I doubted he would now. I'd told Vivri the whole story, and she knew what I had been through, at least superficially. Now, though I hadn't seen her in months, it felt like I couldn't find the right thing to talk about. I wanted to just enjoy this time with my sister, but it felt as though I couldn't speak with her without all of that coming up. Andy, who seemed to be growing more and more uncomfortable with the silence, looked in the rearview mirror at Vivri. She cleared her throat briefly. "So, What do you do on Venlil Prime, Viv? Viv flinched slightly, jostled out of a trance at the sound of her name, or one of Andy's many versions of it at least. Oh. I'm studying meteorology. Oh, weather girl, huh? Sounds fun. What's the weather like on Venlil Prime anyway? Well, we're only really concerned with the habitable zone, but it's normally very calm. Our regulators keep it that way for the most part. The temperature difference on either side of the planet makes some really strong currents between them, and our systems aren't always enough to stop storms from reaching the dawn and dusk areas. Yeah, I bet. The weather must get pretty wild out there. Well, anything outside the habitable zone is kind of a mystery. Very few Venlil are actually crazy enough to venture out there to collect any data, but from the storms we get, we can only assume that the temperatures aren't the only thing to be wary of. Huh. You know, I'd love to visit sometime. You should. Humans seem to do pretty well there. You just need to get used to the gravity. Andy chuckled. I'd probably look all saggy. If we go, you guys can call me Grandma Andy. Vivri laughed and looked over at me. A more serious expression returned to her features. Are you all right? My head snapped back up from my musing. Was it that obvious? Oh, I'm good, well, I guess I don't really know what to say. You look tired. Yeah, I didn't sleep too well last night, I'll be fine, I assured her. Vivri's ears folded slightly. Are you having nightmares again? I'd really rather not talk about that stuff right now. You know I get worried about you when you... I don't want to talk about it. I barked. Viv flinched backward against the door, and I could see Andy's widened eyes in the rearview mirror. It felt reflexive, out of my control. I shook my head. I'm sorry, I don't know what, can we just talk about anything other than that? Vivri leaned forward once more, swallowing. Okay. How are things going with your dog? The mention of Lucky reminded me that she was loose on the farm. Vivri had never even been within a kilometer of a dog, and Lucky could turn up at any time and send her running through the fields. Worse still, if I knew Lucky, she would absolutely chase her just for fun. I wanted their meeting to be a little more gradual, but that wasn't looking like an option. She's doing good. She's enjoying all the open space on the farm, and she seems to get along with the sheep really well. Garrett was worried she'd just eat them, but I'm almost convinced she thinks they're Venlil. I laughed before seeing a nervous look in Vivri's features. Not that she would, we wouldn't let her near them if that was actually the case. Vivri relaxed slightly. That's interesting. You mentioned something about her breaking your leg? She what? Andy glanced back from the front seat. When did this happen? Oh, that was an accident. That was back before I moved out here. She was growing but still had puppy energy. It was my fault, I got too complacent about playing with her. She basically ran into me full force and knocked me over. My leg slammed into a rock and fractured. I lifted my leg and rotated it slightly as I explained. She didn't understand her own strength and how fragile I was compared to her. The look on her face when we got back from the emergency room was priceless. She looked so sorry, whining and hanging her head. She wouldn't leave my side. Staying angry with her is impossible. I chuckled slightly. She's much more of a gentle giant now. Vivri stirred in her seat. So she's never, bitten you? Chased you? Not unless we were playing. She'd never hurt me intentionally. And she isn't going to hurt you if that's what you're worried about. I leaned toward her slightly. I know. I try to trust you on that, but, she's an animal at the end of the day, animals are unpredictable. I shook my head, the human body language almost fully integrated into my own. She's half domesticated. Her wild instincts are far weaker than a pure wolf's. Lucky, in particular, is very, emotionally aware. She knows how I'm feeling before I do sometimes. Vivri seemed slightly surprised. She's intelligent enough to decipher your body language? Well, yeah. She has a tail and ears, and they react to emotion, just like ours, so she caught on pretty fast. Vivri shifted once more. I guess I'm curious to see for myself. Just don't be offended if I keep a safe distance. I laughed awkwardly. It's fine. I can't wait to introduce you. I could see Andy clenching her jaw as she looked at me in the mirror. I fucked up. Hours later, we arrived at Horseshoe Flats and pulled into the gravel lot. Andy parked outside the garage, and we all stepped out into the warm, dry air. I quickly started overheating as I stepped out into the sun in my poncho. I pulled it over my head and rested it on my arm. Vivri approached from the other side of the vehicle. Is that, you know? Oh. Yeah. This is the one. I looked down at the diamond pattern sewn into the poncho. Vivri loosened her stance and held her arm with her other paw as she looked down at it as well. A gust of wind disturbed the gravel lot, kicking up a small cloud of dust as we stood there in silence for a few moments. It looks a lot more colorful in real life. She stood there awkwardly for a moment. What's it made of? It's sheep wool. It's actually a lot like ours. I saw a shocked expression begin crawling over Vivri's face. It's fur, Viv, not a hide. The animals aren't killed or harmed to get it. The horror faded from Vivri's face. She exhaled. Oh, well, that's good. Isn't it a little odd, though? I mean, you have your own fur. She snickered slightly. Well, it's clothing, this is part of human culture. I held the blanket out slightly. Plus, it's a lot more than just a poncho to me. Vivri placed her paws together, flicking her ears. I know. It's beautiful. I heard gruff laughter from the house as we stood there. Well, look at this. Garrett stepped down from the porch. He was an older man with a heavy but stout build. He wore a dirty, blue work shirt covered in splotches of grease and mud. Though his laugh was boisterous, his voice was gentle and airy. I thought I saw a dust cloud speeding away from the farm. Guess now I see why. He approached Vivri and me, a wide smile across his reddened face. You must be Vic's sister, he said cheerfully. Vivri stepped forward timidly. That's right. I'm Vivri. Thomas Garrett. It's wonderful to finally meet you. This has been a long-awaited day for us, we don't get a whole lot of visitors, especially ones from another planet. He laughed as he extended a hand. Vivri was confused for a moment before grabbing his awaiting palm. Oh, sorry, it's been a little while since I've met any humans. That's quite alright, miss. He released her paw and stood between her and me, placing a hand on my shoulder. Your brother has been a big help since we got him here. He's sure got a lot more gears turning in his head than this old farmer. Good to have a big dog around to scare off the coyotes too. He's definitely smart. In a stupid sort of way, she looked past Garrett at me as she laughed. My ears flopped downward in annoyance. At least I'm smart, I shot back. Garrett chuckled gruffly. Seems Venli siblings aren't too different from human siblings. Vivri looked up at him. Where is the dog anyway? Oh, well, she was following me I jabbed him in the side of the leg. The old farmer looked over at me as I shook my head slightly. My ears perked up as I heard rustling in the field. I turned to see the tall grass being parted as something approached closer on the other side of the wooden fence. Vivri took notice of my unease and turned toward the fence herself. What are you? I spun her around, holding her by the shoulders. I put on a cheery expression as I talked hastily. Probably just one of the sheep separated from the herd, we'll take care of it. Why don't we take your stuff over to my place, and I'll show you around the farm. I gestured down the road, beginning to panic slightly. Behind her, I saw Lucky emerge from the grass. Her amber, wolven eyes tracked onto Vivri immediately. She raised her head as her ears perked up, noticing the new friend in the lot. I made sweeping motions with my arms trying to get her to go away, but she seemed to misinterpret it as, "Come on over here and meet your new friend." She eagerly trotted across the gravel toward us. Vivri turned her head before I held the sides of her face to keep Lucky out of her field of view. She grunted. "Vickery, what are you doing? Let me go." "Stay!" I shouted, holding out a paw behind my sister. Lucky looked at me with a vaguely puzzled expression before she sat down, panting excitedly. Realization seemed to overtake Vivri. I felt her stiffen in my grasp. "Is it, Lucky?" she asked shakily. "It's okay. I'm sorry, I was supposed to keep her in the barn, but I overslept, and I didn't have time to find her and..." I stopped rambling as I held her arms. "Please, just don't run.